Growing up in our house felt like living in a shadow. And it wasn't just because of the old, creaky wooden floors or the smell of fresh paint on the walls. It was because of Emily. She was always the one in the spotlight. The one who seemed to get everything right. The older sibling. The one who could do no wrong. In every family photo, there was always that soft glow around her, like she had a personal spotlight shining down. It wasn't a glowing halo or anything overtly obvious. But if you were to ask anyone, who's the favorite? The answer was always clear: Emily. I was the younger sibling, the one who seemed to live life in her shadow. Not in a tragic, suffering way, but in that quiet, subtle kind of way. The kind where you try to be happy for the person you love, but deep down you wish for just a fraction of that recognition. Just a sliver of attention that seemed to always flow her way. The constant admiration. The effortless charm. The respect. It was hard not to feel a little overshadowed when she could do everything so flawlessly. I could never live up to her. Not because I wasn't good enough. I was smart. I was kind. I had my own set of talents, but because she just was everything she did turned to gold. Her grades, her athletic accomplishments, the way she could talk to anyone and make them laugh. It was like she had some natural gift, some invisible quality that everyone wanted to be around. I didn't resent her. How could I? She was my sister after all. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't moments of quiet frustration. From a young age, Emily was the kind of person who commanded attention. Even when she wasn't trying. She was the one who won every award at school. The one who stood at the front of every group photo. The one who gave speeches at family gatherings. She seemed to have the perfect life. The perfect personality, the perfect everything. As for me, I was content to sit in the background, letting her shine. But it wasn't always easy. Sometimes I felt like a second-rate version of her. Not in any outward way. I excelled in my own right. But there was always the nagging feeling that whatever I achieved, however good I was, Emily's success was always just a little more impressive, a little more perfect. I loved her deeply, of course. How could I not? She was my sister, my role model, my best friend in some ways. But it wasn't until I was older that I realized the quiet resentment I sometimes felt wasn't born out of jealousy, but out of a feeling of being overlooked, of being a background character in my own story. Emily and I had our moments. Though, despite the glaring differences in our personalities, we were incredibly close as kids. I'd follow her around like a shadow, always hoping to catch a piece of whatever magic she seemed to possess. She was patient with me, even though I could tell there were times when she wished I'd just give her some space. But she never pushed me away, and that's what I loved about her. Her ability to make you feel like you were important to her, even when she had the world at her feet. But even so, there were the little moments that cut, like when my achievements, however big or small, would be brushed aside in favor of hers. When we'd bring home report cards and everyone would fawn over Emily's straight A's while I stood in the corner, quietly proud of my own solid grades, but never quite receiving the same level of praise. Or when we'd go to a family gathering, and the conversation would always shift toward Emily's latest adventure or her latest accomplishment. Again, I didn't resent her for it. I didn't hate her for being who she was. But as time went on, it became clear she was the one who would always be the star of the show, and I was content with being the supporting character in her life. As we grew older, Emily's life began to shift in a way that I couldn't have anticipated. She met Greg. Greg was the kind of guy who seemed too perfect to be real. Tall, charming, successful, he checked every box. He was the kind of man you'd expect to find in a romantic comedy. The kind of man you'd expect to see walking into a room, shaking hands with everyone, and making everyone around him feel like they were the most important person in the room. And of course, he was completely enamored with Emily. From the moment I met him, I could see why Emily had fallen for him. He was just that guy. The one who made you feel like you mattered. Who had a way of talking to people that made them feel special, and yet, at the same time, made you feel like you were part of something important. He was the perfect match for her. But even so, I couldn't ignore the little feeling of unease that started to settle in my chest. As much as I wanted to be happy for her because this was the love of her life, after all, there was something about Greg that made me nervous. He was too perfect, too smoothie, too good. Was he really the right man for her? But, of course, I never said anything. I didn't want to be that sister, the one who questioned everything, the one who always found fault in people. I didn't want to be the one who was always second-guessing her choices. I kept my opinions to myself, kept my doubts buried deep down, because if I said anything, I knew it would sound petty, or worse, jealous. And then came Lily. When Emily and Greg had Lily, it was like the final piece of the puzzle had been put into place. Their life, the seemingly perfect life, was complete. The photos they shared on social media showed the three of them smiling in front of picturesque backdrops, their lives seeming to unfold exactly as they'd dreamed. They were the family everyone envied, the family everyone wanted to be. I remember the first time I held Lily. She was so tiny, so fragile, but in that moment, I could feel the love Emily and Greg shared for her. Lily was the light of their lives, and I loved her too. I loved her more than I thought I could love anyone. There was something beautiful about seeing Emily, this woman who had always seemed so untouchable, become a mother. And Greg, well, Greg was everything she could have wanted in a partner and a father. The way he would look at Lily, the way he would talk to her in that soft, loving voice, it was impossible not to admire him. He was perfect. For Emily, for Lily, for their little world. They were the golden family. But even as I admired them, I couldn't help but feel that familiar pang in my chest. This was their perfect family, and I was still the one on the outside looking in. Yes, I had my own life, my own successes, my own achievements. But none of that seemed to matter when compared to the image of their flawless family. It was almost as if I was invisible. My achievements, my struggles, my life, none of it held the same weight as the perfect little family they had built. Emily had everything, and I was happy for her, I was. But sometimes, it was hard to breathe in the shadow of perfection. I loved Emily, and I would never want anything bad to happen to her. But at times, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever be seen as enough. If I would ever be the one who could get that kind of adoration and attention. I wanted to be happy for her. I wanted to be the sister who celebrated every step of her life. But sometimes, I couldn't help but feel like I was standing on the edge of her world, just watching from the outside. In those quiet moments, when I wasn't smiling at their perfection or admiring them from afar, I would wonder if I would ever have a family like that. Would I ever be as loved as Emily was? Would I ever be as important as Greg was to her? I didn't want to feel that way. I didn't want to be jealous. But it was there, lingering, quiet and unspoken. And then, Emily's birthday came, and nothing would ever be the same. Emily had always loved birthdays, especially her own. She would get excited over the smallest details, the decorations, the cake, the number of people who showed up. She had this infectious energy that made everyone around her want to celebrate, to make the day as special as possible. And today was supposed to be no different. It was her 30th birthday, and we'd all agreed to make it big. She'd planned a family dinner at her house, a cozy gathering with everyone she loved most. I had helped her organize the decorations, picking up her favorite flowers, setting the table with candles, and picking out the music she adored. Everything felt right, the air was full of warmth and love, and for a moment, I let myself be swept up in it. As I arrived at Emily's house, I could feel the buzz of excitement in the air. The house was decorated with twinkling fairy lights, soft music playing in the background. The laughter of children echoed through the halls as Lily, her little girl, ran from one end of the living room to the other, her giggles filling the space like the sweetest melody. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face glowing with a smile, holding Lily in her lap as Greg stood nearby, looking on with that proud, almost perfect expression. It looked like everything was how it was supposed to be. The perfect family, the perfect moment. But even as I stepped into the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was like walking into a room where you can't pinpoint the exact source of discomfort but feel it nonetheless. It wasn't overt. Emily and Greg weren't arguing, and Lily was full of energy as always, her presence lighting up the room. But there was something in the way Greg kept glancing at his phone, the slight tension in his posture when he wasn't looking at Emily, the way his eyes seemed to avoid hers when she spoke. I noticed it, of course, but I didn't say anything. It was her birthday, after all. I didn't want to ruin the evening by calling attention to the tension that seemed to have settled, like an invisible cloud between them. Instead, I kept my mouth shut, smiling politely and trying to focus on the moment. For her sake, I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted to keep things light, to give her the happiness she deserved. I told myself that maybe I was imagining things. Maybe Greg had just been working too hard. Maybe it was stress from the accident he had months ago that had still left him unsettled. The evening went on without incident. Dinner was served and we all sat together, chatting about the usual things: work, the weather, random family gossip. I could see the effort Emily was putting into keeping the mood light, her usual radiant self. But even as I laughed along with the conversation, I kept catching glimpses of Greg. His smile seemed forced, and though he was engaged with the rest of us, his eyes never quite met Emily's. Every so often he would get a text, and I could see his hand tremble ever so slightly as he looked down at his phone. It was subtle, but it was there. At some point during dinner, Emily excused herself to go check on something in the kitchen. Greg watched her go, but there was something in the way he looked at her back that unsettled me. It wasn't a look of love or admiration. It was the look of someone who was tired, someone who was weary, burdened, maybe even guilty. But I didn't dwell on it. It was Emily's birthday. and I didn't want to start imagining problems that weren't mine to deal with. Then, as the night wore on, the moment came, the one that changed everything. It was after dessert, and we were all relaxing in the living room. Emily was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, Lily's head resting on her shoulder as the little girl fought to keep her eyes open. Greg was across the room, standing by the window, looking outside. I noticed the way he was staring out at the darkness, his face tense. I should have paid more attention, should have asked him what was wrong. But I didn't want to intrude. This was supposed to be a celebration, a day for Emily to feel loved. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard the sound of Emily's voice, suddenly trembling. "I need to take this," she said, standing up quickly. I looked over just in time to see her fumble with her phone, her hands shaking as she excused herself from the room. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe it was just a friend calling to wish her happy birthday. She had a million people who loved her after all. But the tone of her voice as she walked out of the room, it was so quiet, so fragile, like something was happening that she didn't want any of us to see. For a moment, I just stared at her as she walked away, her silhouette framed by the doorway. There was a sense of dread creeping up my spine. I could feel something was coming, something I didn't understand, but I could feel it like a dark cloud settling over us. I sat there in silence, trying to push the feeling aside, but it lingered, and I couldn't stop myself from wondering what was going on. And then I heard her voice shaking from the other room. "Greg, what do you mean? Tell me this isn't real." The words didn't make sense to me at first. I couldn't comprehend them. It was like she was speaking in a foreign language, or at least, that's how it felt. I heard her voice crack and then the silence. And that silence felt like it stretched on for hours. I got up instinctively, following the sound of her voice, unsure of what I was walking into. By the time I reached the doorway, I saw her face, as pale as a sheet, her hand clutching the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, her lips trembling. Lily's gone," she whispered, and the words hit me like a physical blow. I could feel my stomach drop, my heart stop, as the world around me seemed to dissolve. I don't remember how I moved, how I got to her side. I don't remember the exact moments that passed, because in that instant, everything else faded away. All I knew was that my sister, the woman who had been a rock for everyone in this family, had just learned that her entire world had been ripped apart. Her baby girl, her precious Lily, gone. Greg had been in a car accident with Lily, another driver had run a red light. Greg had survived, but Lily, she didn't. It was like the room turned to ice and time itself seemed to freeze. I heard Emily sobbing, her cries filling the silence. With the weight of a grief I couldn't even begin to understand. I don't know how much time passed before we were all in the car, heading to the hospital. Greg was still alive but in critical condition. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. I had no words for her, for him, for myself. All I could think about was the emptiness that had consumed the room. The empty place at the table where Lily would never sit again. The hospital was a blur of sterile white walls and the sound of beeping machines. Emily was there, sitting in silence, her face a picture of utter devastation. She hadn't said a word since the call. What could anyone say? How could anyone offer comfort when the universe had just shattered her life? Greg was in surgery and I was left to wonder, what now? What happens to a family after it's been broken into a million pieces? In the days that followed, Emily became a ghost of the woman she once was. Her sorrow was consuming, overwhelming. She tried to hold it together for the people around her, but there were no words to comfort her. And as we sat by her side, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't just wrong because of the tragedy. Something else was festering beneath the surface. Greg was alive, yes, but Emily's life would never be the same. And as we all waited for news, I couldn't help but wonder, would we ever get our perfect family back? The days that followed Lily's death were like a long, drawn-out nightmare, where everything felt muffled, distant. The world outside continued to move, but for Emily, time had stopped. She was no longer the vibrant woman I had known. She had become a shadow of herself, the grief consuming her in a way that left nothing of the person she had been. I tried to be there for her, to offer what little comfort I could, but I felt so helpless. Words felt pointless. What could anyone say to make sense of the unimaginable? How could I explain to her that everything would be okay when it was clear that her life would never be the same again? We spent those first few days in a haze. Emily barely spoke, her eyes hollow, her face ashen, her body limp as though it was too heavy for her to carry. I could see the effort it took just to drag herself out of bed, to face another day of agony. She couldn't stop crying. There was no pause to the grief. The moments when she would sob in my arms were the worst. I felt the tears on my own cheeks, not from my own pain, but from the helplessness that gnawed at me. Watching someone you love suffer so deeply, with no way of easing their pain, is one of the most agonizing experiences anyone can go through. But it wasn't just her suffering that I had to contend with, there was him. Greg. Greg, the man who had once been the picture of the perfect husband and father, now seemed like a ghost of himself. Or maybe he was the same as he always had been, but now, the cracks that had been there all along began to show. Emily's world had crumbled and Greg seemed to be splintering with it. But what bothered me was not just the weight of his own grief, but the selfishness that seemed to radiate from him. He barely spoke to Emily, in fact. I couldn't remember the last time I had seen him hold her, comfort her, or even attempt to console her. Instead, he seemed preoccupied with his own suffering, consumed with the guilt of surviving the accident that had claimed their daughter. But even as he sat by her side, his eyes never met hers. He was distant, far too distant for someone who had lost his child. The man I had once respected now seemed like a stranger to me, lost in his own world of turmoil. While Emily was drowning in hers, he would sit by Emily's side, but his attention was never truly on her. His eyes would wander. He would pull out his phone every few minutes, checking messages, scrolling through social media, as if the world hadn't just collapsed around us. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but they weren't trembling in sorrow. They trembled from something else, something I couldn't put my finger on, but something I knew was there, something that didn't sit right with me. As the days passed, I started to notice more signs of Greg's odd behavior. He became more erratic. His presence in the house felt more like a burden than a comfort. He would pace around the living room, his thoughts clearly elsewhere, or mutter to himself in ways that made me uneasy. Whenever Emily would look at him with those pleading eyes, he would turn away, offering her only weak, fragmented words. It was as though he was more focused on his own inner torment than on the woman who had just lost her child. And then there were the late nights, when Emily would fall asleep in the chair by the window, exhausted from the endless cycle of crying and grief. Greg would stay up, sometimes alone, sometimes with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the empty space like a man who had already given up. There were moments when I felt like I was the only one holding the fragile threads of sanity together in the house. I was the one who had to care for Emily, keep her alive, keep her from sinking deeper. But all the while, I kept watching Greg. I watched as he became more withdrawn, more unreachable. I wasn't sure if he was trying to escape the house, his own thoughts, or the guilt that had consumed him. But I began to feel like he was shutting Emily and me out. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew something was off. And that gut feeling was growing stronger by the day. It wasn't until a week after Lily's funeral that the truth came crashing down. The truth I had been so afraid to acknowledge. It started with a phone call. I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to make some tea for Emily. I had promised her she would get some rest, but she had barely slept in days. I felt this unbearable need to do something for her, to keep moving, even if I was moving in circles. That's when Greg came into the room. He looked even more tired than usual, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and too many late nights. His hands were shaking and I could tell he was on edge. But there was something else, something colder about him. I couldn't quite explain it. His body was here, but his mind was elsewhere. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low and strained. My stomach dropped and I stood there for a moment, unsure if I should stay or walk away. Part of me was still angry at him. How could he do this to Emily? To their family? He was a stranger now, and yet he was still the man who had been by her side for all those years. "Is this about Emily?" I asked, my voice filled with frustration. "No, it's..." He hesitated, swallowing hard before continuing. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long time ago." The air in the room shifted. I felt my heart race and a wave of dread swept over me. "I'm listening," I said, my voice more forceful than I intended. Greg took a deep breath and ran his fingers through his hair. He seemed torn, like a man caught in a moral dilemma. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to say, "I've been having an affair." The words hit me like a slap to the face. My mind reeled. I felt dizzy for a second, my hands trembling. I couldn't even process what I had just heard. Greg had been having an affair. For months. For years, maybe? How could this be true? "What?" I asked, barely able to form the words. "I didn't want to tell you this," he continued, his voice cracking under the weight of his confession. "But it's the truth. I've been seeing someone else. Someone I shouldn't have. And I was so caught up in my own guilt, my own everything, that I just couldn't bring myself to tell Emily." I stood there, stunned. I wanted to scream, to shout at him for being so selfish, for betraying Emily in the worst possible way. But all I could do was stand there, trying to process the enormity of what he had just admitted. "You're telling me this now?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Greg's face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw something resembling genuine regret in his eyes. He looked down, ashamed. But it didn't change the fact that the damage had already been done. The woman he had sworn to love, to protect, had just lost her daughter. And now, he was telling me he had been unfaithful the entire time. I don't expect you to forgive me, Greg said, his voice weak. She has to know. Emily deserves the truth. And that was it. The betrayal, the lies, everything came rushing to the surface in that moment. Greg had not only failed Emily as a husband, but now he had failed her as a father. He had betrayed her trust, shattered the fragile bond they had built, and now, he wanted to add to her pain by confessing his sins. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? The truth was out, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, I didn't know what to do with the knowledge of Greg's affair. I didn't want to be the one to break the news to Emily. She had just lost her daughter. How could I lay another layer of betrayal on her already broken heart? But the truth had to come out. And so, with a heavy heart, I gathered the evidence. The text messages, the pictures, the proof of his lies. I couldn't let him get away with this. Emily deserved to know. The days after Greg's confession felt like a fog of anger and confusion. I could barely think straight, let alone figure out what to do. It was like I had been given this horrible secret, one that had no easy solution, and I had no idea how to handle it. Greg had betrayed Emily not just with the affair, but with his selfishness and complete disregard for her well-being. It was a weight I wasn't sure how to carry. The house had become a shell of what it once was. Emily was barely holding it together, lost in her grief, and Greg, instead of being there for her, seemed to be more concerned with himself. I kept telling myself I needed to focus on supporting Emily, to put all my energy into being there for her. But how could I when everything about this situation felt wrong? How could I support her while living a lie? While knowing that the very person she was relying on had shattered her trust beyond repair? Greg had confessed to the affair, but he hadn't really apologized. There was no real remorse in his eyes, no genuine regret for the pain he had caused. He hadn't come to me out of guilt or a desire to make things right. He had come to me because he was cornered, because he realized that his lies were starting to unravel. He didn't want Emily to find out. He didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. I was just a tool to him, a way to protect himself. But I wasn't about to let him manipulate me. The first attempt at manipulation. I don't know what I was expecting when I saw Greg the next day. I hadn't spoken to him much since his confession. Everything had been awkward, heavy with unspoken words. But when he knocked on my door, I wasn't ready for the conversation that was about to unfold. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative but with an edge of urgency. "It's about Emily." His words sent a wave of dread through me. I had a feeling I knew exactly where this conversation was going. "I don't think there's much to talk about," I replied, my voice sharp. "You've already said enough." Greg's eyes flickered nervously, but he pushed forward anyway. "No, listen, you don't understand. I need you to help me. Emily, she can't find out about the affair. Not now, not with everything that's happened. She's already been through enough. I need you to keep this between us." His words hit me like a slap. Keep it between us? He was asking me to lie, to cover up the truth and protect him while Emily, his wife, the mother of his child, was grieving, devastated by the loss of their daughter. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how selfish he was being. But instead, I just stood there, cold and still, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know I've messed up, but you have to understand. I can't lose her," Greg continued, his voice becoming more frantic. "If she finds out about the affair now, after everything, it'll destroy her. I know you're close to her. I know you care about her. Please, don't let me lose everything." I looked at him, my mind racing. He was trying to guilt-trip me, to manipulate me into keeping his dirty secret. He thought that by appealing to my sense of loyalty to Emily, I would help him cover up his mistakes. He thought that I would protect him, just as he had always been the center of his own world. "Greg, you don't get to ask me that," I said, my voice growing stronger with every word. "You don't get to use Emily's grief to protect yourself. What you did was wrong, and it's not my job to make sure you don't face the consequences of your actions. It's not my job to cover up the truth. You need to face what you've done." Greg stared at me, his expression hardening for a moment before softening again, like he was trying to play the victim. "You don't understand. I'm already going through hell. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just don't tell her yet, please." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. His grief wasn't real. It wasn't about the loss of their daughter. It wasn't about Emily's pain. It was about him, about Greg trying to avoid the consequences of his actions at all costs. He wasn't worried about Emily, he was worried about himself. I felt a surge of anger boil up inside me. He was asking for so much, for a second chance, for my silence, for my complicity, and it was all built on his lies and his selfishness. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not going to protect you. You should have thought about this before. You don't get to use Emily's grief to save yourself. You don't get to make her pain about you. If you really cared about her, you'd be honest with her. For a moment, Greg didn't speak. He just stood there staring at me, his face red with frustration and guilt. It was almost as if he hadn't expected me to refuse him. But I wasn't going to back down, I couldn't. The decision to act. As the days passed, I found myself growing increasingly frustrated with Greg. His attempts to guilt trip me only strengthened my resolve to do the right thing. Emily needed the truth. She needed to know what had really happened, not just about the affair, but about everything Greg had been hiding from her. She deserved the full picture, not the version that Greg wanted her to see. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I wasn't going to let him keep manipulating her, keep using her pain to protect himself. She had already lost so much: her daughter, her trust, her family. I couldn't let her lose herself too, not to Greg's lies. And so, I made a decision. I would take matters into my own hands. I would give Emily the truth. It wasn't just about Greg's affair anymore, it was about Emily's right to know what had been happening behind her back. What Greg had been doing to her while she was living in a world of perfect lies. I spent the next day gathering everything I could find: texts, emails, even phone records. The evidence was damning. Greg had been hiding this for months, and now I had everything I needed to expose him. I felt a strange sense of calm as I compiled it all. There was no more doubt in my mind. This was the right thing to do. Emily deserved to know, and if it meant destroying her already broken heart, so be it. She had to face the truth. When I finally confronted her, I wasn't sure what to expect. She had been so fragile, so vulnerable since Lily's death, and I knew this would break her all over again. But I also knew that if I didn't tell her now, Greg would find a way to bury it all, to keep her in the dark forever. "Emily, I need to show you something," I said, my voice soft but firm as I handed her the stack of papers. "It's about Greg." Her eyes went wide with confusion, and I could see the fear in her face. She knew something was coming, but I don't think she was ready for what I was about to show her. As she looked through the evidence, her face went pale. She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the words in disbelief, the betrayal sinking in. I stood there in silence, watching as her world crumbled around her once again. But this time, it wasn't the death of her daughter, it was the death of the man she had trusted. The man who had deceived her every step of the way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily looked up at me, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry," I said, my heart breaking for her. "But you needed to know. You deserve the truth." The truth was out, and there was no going back. Emily knew what Greg had done. She knew about the affair, the lies, the betrayal. I had given her the evidence, forced her to face the ugly reality of what her husband had done to her, to their family. Her pain was unimaginable, but there was something else. I saw in her eyes. Something that hadn't been there before. It was anger. It was resolve. She wasn't going to let him get away with this. She wasn't going to let him destroy her any further. And neither was I. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose, a deep, burning need for justice. Emily deserved to be free of this man. She deserved to reclaim her life, her peace of mind. And I was going to make sure Greg paid for everything he had done. I spent the next few days doing something I never thought I'd do. I turned into a detective. But this wasn't some twisted game, it was personal. Greg had played a dangerous game for months, hiding his affair, manipulating everyone around him, including me. But now, the tables had turned. Now, it was my turn to expose him for what he really was. I started small. His phone records were easy to obtain thanks to a few strategic phone calls. It was like pulling the strings of a puppet, watching as everything fell into place. Then, I moved on to the texts, his interactions with his lover. The constant lies, the way he had tried to justify his actions to her. The messages were damning, so full of guilt and deceit that I could hardly believe what I was reading. But I knew it was real. This was Greg's dark side, the side he had kept hidden behind a facade of charm and success. I didn't stop there. I hacked into his email, digging through months of correspondence, uncovering even more lies. He had been so careless, so arrogant, thinking that he could keep this secret forever. But he hadn't counted on me, on my determination to make sure the truth came to light. I remember sitting at my desk, the evidence spread out in front of me, and for a moment, I was overcome with a sense of power. Greg had tried to control everything: his image, his life, Emily's perception of him. But now, the control was mine. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about justice. It was about showing him that no one, no matter how successful or charming, could escape the consequences of their actions. And then, I did something I knew would destroy him. I shared everything, exposing the truth. I started with Emily. She had to see the full extent of Greg's betrayal. She had to know every detail, every text message, every email, every lie he had told her. I watched as she went through the evidence, her face paling, her body trembling as she realized how deep Greg's deception went. But it wasn't just Emily I wanted to expose him to. It wasn't enough for Greg to feel the pain of his own actions. No, I wanted him to feel the weight of his lies in every part of his life. I started with his colleagues, his business partners, people who looked up to him, admired him, and trusted him. People who didn't know the real Greg, the man who had been sneaking around behind their backs. I reached out to them one by one. I wasn't subtle. I sent them the texts, the emails, the photos. I made sure they knew what kind of person they had been working with. The man they thought they knew was nothing but a fraud. He had lied to them just as he had lied to Emily. And as his professional world began to crumble, so did his reputation. The whispers started. The rumors spread like wildfire. People began to look at him differently, to question his integrity. Business deals that he had been counting on fell through. People who had once praised him now turned their backs on him. Greg's carefully curated image, the image of the perfect husband, the perfect father, the successful businessman, was slipping away piece by piece. And all of it was because of his own mistakes, his own choices, his lies. Greg's world crumbles. I watched as everything he had worked for began to unravel. It was slow at first. He would get phone calls in the middle of the night, urgent meetings canceled, and his emails flooded with responses he hadn't expected. The gossip at the office became impossible to ignore. People who had once respected him now saw him for what he truly was: a liar, a cheater, a man who cared more about his own image than the people he was supposed to love and protect. His colleagues began avoiding him. His business partners started to distance themselves. People who had once sung his praises now spoke of him in hushed tones. I could see it all from the outside. Greg was sinking, slowly but surely, and no matter how hard he tried to stop it, he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. But it wasn't just his work life that was collapsing. His personal life was crumbling, too. Emily was no longer the woman who had looked at him with love and admiration. She was the woman who saw him for who he truly was, a man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And though it pained me to see her go through this, I knew she was stronger than she realized. She was reclaiming her life, one painful step at a time. And then, the day finally came. The day I had been waiting for. I had made sure the truth had spread far and wide. Greg's professional life had been decimated, and now, it was time to confront him. I walked into his office with a sense of calm that surprised even me. The building smelled sterile, cold. The halls were quiet, empty. And it felt almost surreal, like walking into a different world. I had spent so many years looking up to this man, admiring his success, his polished persona. And now, here I was, standing in front of his office, ready to watch it all come crashing down. I knocked on the door, and when he looked up, I saw the panic in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me to be the one to do this, to take everything from him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough, tired. He hadn't been sleeping well, I could tell. The pressure of everything was weighing down on him. "I think you know why I'm here," I said calmly, stepping into his office. I closed the door behind me, the sound of it clicking shut echoing in the silence. He stood up, his face pale, his hands shaking. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you can't just..." "Don't worry," I interrupted, cutting him off. "I've already done it. The truth is out. Everyone knows. Your colleagues, your business partners, your friends, they all know who you really are." His face twisted in horror, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The man who had controlled everything for so long, who had manipulated those around him, was now powerless. He was exposed. There was nowhere left to hide. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Please, you have to understand." "No," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "You don't get to play the victim. You made your choices, Greg, and now you have to face the consequences." He staggered back, his eyes wild, as though he were about to collapse. "You can't do this," he whispered. "It's too late," I said, turning to leave. "You've already done it to yourself." As I walked out of his office, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The revenge wasn't about hurting him. It was about giving Emily the justice she deserved. It was about showing Greg that his lies had consequences. It was about making sure he would never again get away with hurting the people who loved him. And as I left the building, I knew that, for the first time in a long time, I had done something right. Greg's life had unraveled, and it was all because of his own choices. The weight of the betrayal hung heavily in the air. Emily, once consumed by grief, now found herself grappling with a new, devastating reality. Greg's affair wasn't just a betrayal of their marriage. It was a betrayal of everything she thought they had built together. But amid the heartbreak, something else began to emerge in her: a quiet strength, a resolve to reclaim her life. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Emily's voice broke the silence. "I can't stay with him," she whispered, her words quiet but final. Her eyes were clear now, no longer filled with confusion or doubt. She had made the decision. The man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her trust in the most unimaginable way, could no longer be a part of her life? The shock in her words wasn't the realization that she had reached this point. It was the strength in her tone. She wasn't just saying this to herself. She was making it real. The tears she had shed for days, the heartbreak, all led her to this moment of clarity. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice faltering slightly. But I can't live like this anymore. I took her hand in mine, giving it a gentle squeeze. You don't have to do this alone. You have me. For the first time since Lily's death and the revelation of Greg's affair, I saw a flicker of determination in Emily's eyes. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was starting to live again. The first step was the hardest, filing for divorce. Greg's manipulation had kept Emily in a place of fear and uncertainty for too long. She had never fully controlled their finances, their home, or even the direction of their marriage. But now, she was taking control of everything that had once been out of her hands. We met with an attorney who carefully explained the process. Emily was quiet but resolute. She signed the paperwork, her eyes never leaving the document, as though every word on the page marked a new chapter of her life. But it wasn't just about the divorce. It was about reclaiming what Greg had stolen from her peace, her dignity, and most importantly, her autonomy. Emily started taking charge of her finances, something Greg had always controlled. Together, we went through bills, savings, and investments, making sure she had what she needed to move forward. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, times when the weight of everything threatened to pull her back. But every day, Emily grew stronger. Slowly, the grief that had defined her life for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet strength, a determination to build something new. With each step, Emily regained control of her life. She was no longer the woman devastated by betrayal. She was the woman taking back what had been hers all along. And I couldn't have been prouder of her. The dust had settled, and the weight that had hung over Emily and me for so long was finally lifting. Greg's fall from grace was nothing short of spectacular. His lies had been exposed, his career and reputation destroyed, and his carefully crafted world unraveled. But as I watched him spiral, there was no sense of satisfaction in the chaos he created for himself. There was only the quiet realization that the downfall of everything he had built on deceit was the natural consequence of his actions. Revenge had never been about cruelty. It had never been about enjoying the suffering of others. In the end, it was about giving Emily the justice she deserved, giving her back the dignity Greg had stolen, and the peace she had been denied. She had been broken by grief and betrayal, but now she was reclaiming everything: her life, her future, her independence. Watching Greg lose everything didn't bring me joy, but it did bring a sense of closure. The man who had manipulated and deceived those around him, who had thought he could control the narrative, was now powerless. He had no one left to hide behind. The truth had come out, and no amount of apologies or regrets could change the reality of what he had done. Emily, though, was different. She wasn't the same woman who had once been blinded by love for Greg. The betrayal had cut deep, but the scar it left was one of strength, not weakness. She had walked away from the life she thought she had, but she was rebuilding it. And this time, on her own terms. She took control of her life, her finances, her future, her dignity. The woman who had once relied on Greg was now standing tall, making decisions for herself, and creating a future she could be proud of. The journey wasn't easy, and there were days when she doubted herself, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. But with each step, she grew stronger. For me, the closure wasn't just in watching Greg face the consequences of his actions. It was in seeing Emily take back what had been stolen from her. It was in watching her stand on her own 2 feet, no longer dependent on someone who had betrayed her. It was in knowing that, despite everything, she had emerged from this ordeal more powerful than ever before.
Looking back, there's a lesson in all of this. Revenge, when driven by desire for justice rather than bitterness, can be a form of reclaiming what was taken from us. It's not about inflicting pain, it's about balance. It's about making sure that those who hurt us understand the cost of their actions. In the end, Emily and I both took back what was ours: peace, dignity, and control over our lives. And that was the true reward, not the destruction of someone else, but the rebuilding of ourselves. The lesson? We are stronger than we think, and sometimes the greatest revenge is finding the courage to take control and live life on our own terms.